Good afternoon. Welcome to the Practical Measures to Reduce Soil Erosion webinar. My name is Grace Choto. I'm an AHDB Knowledge Exchange Manager for vegetables in horticulture. A few housekeeping points. You're all muted so we don't pick up background noise. If you've got any questions, please don't wait. Type them in as speakers are presenting and we'll pick them at the end of their presentations. We are timing this webinar. We will be done by 3:30. We are recording it as well because we want to make it available on our website for those who might have missed it. We have applied for basis points. They are not yet through, but you can still send us your details when they come through. And normally we get between 1 and 2 points because they look at the time we are presenting. And we've argued cases to try and get more. It's really difficult. But we've gotten a roster of points. Again, I'll show you, how to submit them to us, and we'll send them on. If you're tweeting, it's at AHDB Hort. So because you're muted, you will have like a band on the right of your screen. If you can see my mouse, I've literally got a little red arrow on there. You can either minimize this band or you can maximize it. And if you scroll down to it, you'll come to a bit which says questions. Type them in there, the questions as we go. Like I said, basis and roster points, you need to email Maya Kotecha, and that's her email address at maya.kotecha@ahdb.org.uk. We have recordings of other webinars I've run because although I work in horticulture, I'm also responsible for soils KE in horticulture. So things we've done as well as other AHDB webinars on a range of topics can be found on the AHDB website. So for things linked to horticulture, we've got a horticulture events archive page, which you can Google and you should be able to get to the pages. So I know that some of you are joining us again. This is the third of 3 webinars I've run this autumn. And these slides will be familiar to you, but for our new people, please just note that we have our own Great Soils Project program of work. This is the AHDB banner of work. It's all under this, the banner Great Soils. And on there, we've got so many resources, and I'll point to them in the next slide. But literally also AHDB are facilitators on an EU Best for Soil project, which I also have to publicize, and I will cover a few slides on that. Again, that project has a lot of resources, soils related resources. So just coming on to our own Great Soils banner of work, this is really an extensive program of research and knowledge exchange work to help farmers and growers to improve soil health. As you know, AHDB, we've got those 6 levy sectors. And what's happened, because we came together, we had resources all across the board on soils or on the same subjects, but now we're pulling them together. Yes, our website is an issue, but it is work in progress, and we're trying to improve it as we go. But we've got on there under Great Soils, you can see here on my left, we've got a fact sheet which is linked to a talk we're going to have today from Lynda, one of our speakers, but it's a fact sheet which was written by Rob Simmons, who's also speaking on engineering the landscape to secure asparagus production. Although it's on asparagus, the principles within apply to soil erosion control across the crops. Again, some of our publications may not be labeled Great Soils, like this biofumigation guide, although it's for potato cyst nematodes, it's got a lot, the principles are applicable across the board. So in terms of, for example, when do you actually take down your biofumigant to get the most, the actives in there to kill the nematodes. So have a look, and if you can't find anything on our website, a quick way is to go to Google, type in, for example, biofumigation and AHDB, and then you should be able to pick it up straight away. Again, on the Great Soils banner of the project, you'll have a lot of soil publications, fact sheets, and videos. There are a lot of them. Like I said, it's a legacy as well. We're different levy boards. We're coming together. But again, soils is so vast, which is why we ran 3 webinars, The first webinar that we ran was on organic matter and cover crops. The second one was on soil disinfestation, and today's one is on soil erosion control. So, because soils are, it's a holistic big system, it's really hard to fit all in one guide, but we've got all these resources that are available. If not for you, you can point them out to others who might not know as much as you on soils. So just moving on to this EU Best for Soils project that we are facilitators on. This is an EU Horizon 2020 network project, which is ending next year in September. It's got 8 project partners across the EU, and these are mostly applied researchers and advisors, as well as 20 facilitators. We are invited facilitators, really, stakeholders, because we've got that touch with practitioners. And our role really also started last year to the end of 30 September 2021. The project aims to improve soil health across Europe through the promotion of 4 best practices and sound crop rotations. Again, it's also got a lot of free resources, fact sheets, videos, and free access databases. Again, I've looked at resources, our own Great Soils resources, the EU Best for Soils resources, and it's a mixed bag. You've got some highly technical publications, but also some other basic ones. So you pick out, what's relevant for you. Likewise, don't be dismissive. If you've got younger people or people who are not as knowledgeable as you on soils, point them out to these resources, and they will be useful to bring them up to speed. So the 4 best practices the EU project is trying to promote is the use of compost, organic amendments, biosolarization, crop covers, anaerobic soil disinfestation. And it's got 2 databases, one on pathogens and one on nematodes to aid with rotational planning. And they are good. I will schedule in another webinar on the nematodes database. They are being built, but essentially it's a tool to risk rate the potential of nematodes damage on a crop when you sequence it within a specific rotation, because what they've done is they've looked at crops that are susceptible to nematodes. They've done a massive work package on data mining, and literally they've said, if you've got this crop, this is how much damage it will have from these types of nematodes. And then then it will build up the nematodes population, or maybe not build up the nematodes population. And then if you have your next crop which is susceptible to this particular nematodes, you might be in trouble. So it's a tool really to aid with rotational planning. Again, like I said, it's got a lot of fact sheets and videos, so have a look. So on to the program. Our program today, we have 3 speakers, and the first speaker that we've got is from Professor Jane Rickson. She's a professor of soil erosion and conservation at Cranfield. All our speakers are from Cranfield University, and Jane will be speaking on soil erosion, causes, consequences, and cures. After that, we'll have Rob Simmons. Rob is a reader in sustainable soil management, and Rob is speaking on Tramline wheeling management case studies. And our final speaker will be Lynda Deeks, who's a research fellow in soil science, and she will speak on reducing soil erosion using landscape engineering. So there are our 3 speakers. Our speakers are all applied agriculture and horticulture researchers from the Cranfield Soil and Agrifood Institute, Cranfield University. They are going through research and commercially applied case studies demonstrating how to prevent small-scale and large-scale soil erosion. So I'm just going to introduce our first speaker and welcome her, Professor Jane Rickson. Jane has over 30 years experience of research, consultancy, and teaching in soil and water engineering. She specializes in soil degradation processes and sustainable land management. Jane's work focuses on the better understanding of soil functions and their role in delivery of ecosystems, goods, and services. And she has led and been a part of many projects to include AHDB funded work, DEFRA funded work, the Welsh Government, and the Committee on Climate Change. And some of this has been literally linked to this topic. So, for example, better understanding of the soil protection landscape under DEFRA, the total cost of soil degradation in England and Wales, again, DEFRA, and then a provision of research to develop the evidence base on soil erosion for the Committee on Climate Change. So what we'll do, Jane will present, we'll have questions, then Rob, Lynda will present, and then after them we'll have a panel as well. So an exciting program from people who know what they're talking about. I can vouch for that. So over to you, please, Jay.
Thank you very much, Grace. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides and they're in presentation mode?
Yes, I can see that. I can see them.
Brilliant. Excellent. Very good. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Grace. Thank you for that introduction. And welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I hope this finds everybody safe and well. And I really hope this webinar is going to be of interest and hopefully of some practical use as well. So I'm delighted to join everybody with my colleagues, Rob and Lynda. We're all field scientists. I think we would call ourselves field scientists. And we're very much working at the coalface of helping farmers and growers to mitigate soil degradation processes. And today's webinar is going to be about soil erosion specifically. I've worked in soil erosion now for over 30 years, man and boy, no, I don't mean that, looking particularly at the causes of soil erosion, also the consequences, trying to value the damage that can be done by soil erosion. But then when we're looking all very pessimistic about all the problems, then I hope what this webinar will show is the positive side of what can be done about it. And if you think of nothing else or take home nothing else from today's webinar, prevention is better than cure. That really, really applies for things like soil erosion. So hopefully I will move on to my next slide. What I'm going to cover in the next 15 minutes or so is a sort of a bit of an introduction. First of all, talking about the importance of soil. Really, I'm preaching to the converted there. So, but just to put it into sort of context, I want to give some definitions of soil erosion as to what we're dealing with here. You can see some illustrations of the consequences of soil erosion on the right-hand side there. Issues of soil erosion by wind in the top slide, erosion by water, and then, as I say, just when we're looking very pessimistic and depressed about the problem, then hopefully we can come up with solutions that are sustainable and cost-effective solutions to help you and your businesses overcome the issues of soil erosion. To start to design some of those erosion control measures that Rob and Lynda are going to be talking about, I think it's really important to understand the factors affecting soil erosion and what we can actually do about it. You know, we hear a lot about climate change. Well, is there much that we can do about these more intense, more frequent, longer duration rainfall events? Probably not at a local level. Obviously, globally, there are things that we can do, but locally. So what are the other factors that affect erosion that we can actually do something about? And those practical measures are really the focus of this afternoon's webinar. So that's really what I want to try and cover, as I say, in the next 15 minutes or so. And I'd be delighted to take any questions that may arise. So I love this quote. I think this quote really is going to be on my gravestone when I die, because ultimately this is what we're dealing with here, that the thin layer of soil covering the Earth's surface represents the difference between survival and extinction for most terrestrial life. And I think if you think about what you have for your lunch today, 94% of our food comes from soil. And when you think about it as a resource, it is just that very, very thin layer of soil. And the analogy I've got there is with an apple. You imagine the planet being an apple. About 3/4 of that apple, if you cut that apple in half and a quarter, about 3/4 of that, we can't grow crops. There's no soil. It's things like oceans and mountains and salt marshes where we can't have agricultural production. So we have to focus that food production, as well as timber supplies and all the other things that we get from land, in that quarter of an apple. And then when you think that the soil itself represents the peel of that apple represents the soil, that we have to do all these amazing things like produce food, like regulate water and carbon and so on. And so you realise we've got a finite resource here that we really have to look after. And when we get the sort of soil erosion, again, that's illustrated on these photographs, in some places we're dealing with very shallow soils, you know, less than 10 centimetres deep, maybe 0, where we've got subsoil exposed. Then when you put on top of that soil erosion processes, as you can see in the middle slide, and obviously all of that precious soil resource then goes out into our rivers and lakes and oceans. And again, you can see this image, this satellite image of where all of that wonderful soil resource that we have to produce food and regulate water and carbon and so on, where that all ends up in the oceans and rivers and so on. So that's kind of the challenge that we face. I want to talk now about the definitions of soil erosion, and forgive me for sort of going back to basics, but I do think it helps. It's a bit like when you go to the doctor, you have to know the problem before you come up with a solution and the medicine that's going to make you better. Same applies for soil erosion. Soil erosion is the removal of soil, rock, artificial fill, or any slope-forming materials by erosive agents. And those erosive agents are rainfall, runoff or surface overland flow, wind, gravity, biotic factors such as animals. There's a fantastic paper that I had to review about the impact of gophers on erosion rates in the US, which was a fascinating story, a paper to review. And then we also see another process of soil erosion where material soils are actually co-extracted on root crops or farm vehicles or farm implements, particularly when the soils are very wet and have got quite a high clay content. Then again, by definition, that is the removal of soil from our fields, and that represents a form of soil erosion as well. It's not just me, Rob and Lynda, who think this is the significant problem that needs to be addressed. It is identified as a major threat to soil resources in Europe. And that's in the EU thematic strategy on soil protection, which has really driven soil protection policy, obviously pre-Brexit. But then when you look at some of the Brexit legislation and policy formulation, things like the DEFRA 25-year Environment Plan, the Agriculture Act, the Environment Bill, all of those mention soil loss and soil erosion. So, you know, it is a driver at government level. And obviously the impacts are being felt at very local level. And I've put a question mark there that it is an irreversible process. I've listed here all the different forms of soil degradation that have been identified. And you'll see that most of things like compaction and salinization and contamination and organic matter loss, these can be reversed. You know, you can build up organic matter, you can alleviate compaction. But soil erosion, once that soil resource has gone, it's gone. It takes thousands of years to form a few centimetres of soil. So it is effectively a finite resource that is lost through soil erosion. And that, I would argue, is an irreversible process. And we've seen it before in places like the Dust Bowl. I'm not saying for 1 minute that what we face in the UK is the same as the Dust Bowl, but you know, soil degradation, the same processes are operating there. So why bother? Why should we bother? So what? I can hear you say, well, so what? There's been a lot of work looking at the consequences of soil erosion, the on-site consequences of soil erosion or a loss of soil depth, things like loss of production of food, fibre, fodder and biofuels. And yes, you can mask that effect by adding more nutrients or maybe irrigating to overcome the loss of soil, so you keep your productivity up. But sometimes those measures, those masking measures, can be very expensive and probably not sustainable. And you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, this is some work that we did for DEFRA, which was trying to give some evidence of the impact of decreasing soil depth as a result of erosion, for example, and what effect that had on yield and biomass. And you can see, not surprisingly, as you go from a 50 centimetre deep soil, same soil type, down to 30 centimetres and 10 centimetres as a result of erosion, losing that soil resource, needless to say, you get a decline in that yield, that biomass, and obviously that is going to affect your bottom line in terms of production. And I've listed here again things like losing nutrients, your carbon, your water holding capacity. Once that soil is gone, you've got less of a sponge to absorb these heavy rainfall events, but also less ability to hold the water during drought and lack of rainfall. You don't have that storage capacity there. There's impacts on biodiversity and cultural features. You know, we work with the MOD, for example, on Salisbury Plain, big issues about soil erosion, starting to expose some of these cultural, archaeological features which can damage them. But actually, it's the off-site consequences of erosion, where all that sediment, all that soil ends up, that are particularly of concern. And again, you can see some illustrations here of where that precious resource ends up, clogging up rivers, blocking ditches on roads, impacting communications infrastructure, and so on. So I'm really sort of painting a very negative picture as to why we need to do something about soil erosion. And this is some work, again, that we did for DEFRA, which was trying to put a number to it rather than just pretty pictures, or ugly pictures, I should say, of erosion. And we looked at different forms of degradation in the column here, in the first column. And to cut to the chase, by the time you cost up the financial costs of erosion, we estimate it's about £212 million every year that it's costing UK PLC. Oh, I say UK, this is England and Wales figures. We've just recently done the same exercise for Scotland, and that came to a cost of about £50 million every year associated with soil erosion. So I think it's useful, again, I think this will relate to what Rob and Lynda are going to say, in looking at those soil erosion processes, because then we can understand what we might do to actually interrupt those processes. So first of all, we have the detachment of soil particles and small aggregates from the soil surface, as you can see in this the illustration here, that individual raindrop falling on the soil mass. And that detachment of soil particles can occur through the rain splashing on the surface, or it may occur through runoff or overland flow, or it may occur by wind. So that very first process of detaching particles. Once they're detached, those particles then are transported away from that site, again by rain splash in these jets of water that come out from that rain splash impact. But more effectively, they are carried away by runoff or overland flow, as you can see in the second photograph, or indeed wind may transport those as well. And then somewhere in the landscape, those detached and transported particles and aggregates will be deposited, sometimes permanently, but often just temporarily, until the next rainfall event or the next wind blow occurs, whereby we start the whole process again, and we have detachment again and transport. And it's often been described as a jerky conveyor belt of this soil sediment moving through the landscape, storm after storm after storm. Just some pretty pictures, or ugly pictures, as I say, about the different types of soil erosion processes that we see in the UK. Things like rain splash erosion, I've mentioned, sheet erosion. This is Epping Forest, where heavy recreational pressure has removed the vegetation, leading to this characteristic sheet erosion as the soil has been exposed to rainfall. Through rills, often on cultivated land, and then gullies, which are a particular problem because by definition they cannot be ploughed out, they cannot be crossed by agricultural machinery or implements, so it's very difficult to plough those out from season to season. And again, wind erosion problems. This is an onion field that was being harvested. I took this picture in the summer this year in a field in Norfolk, unknown location, but you can see the amount of dust and soil that is being eroded from there. And then things like mass movements as well, massive movement of soil from the landscape. We do quite a lot of work at Cranfield trying to measure these erosion processes to get a handle on how bad the problem is, whether it's field surveys, working in the lab on simulations, or using erosion models to try and predict erosion rates for what-if scenarios. What if I change my land use? What happens under climate change scenarios? Am I going to get more erosion risk? Well, possibly, probably yes. But we can simulate different field conditions that may enhance or protect against erosion. And again, our work has identified to actually try to quantify these different forms of erosion: wind erosion, tillage erosion, the co-extraction on root crops that I mentioned, and then water erosion. And I think the take-home message from this slide is the rates of erosion can be as high as 15 tonnes per hectare per year. Well, what does that mean? Difficult to visualize, but if you then compare that with the rate of soil formation, which is estimated to be about 1 tonne per hectare per year, you can see in places, not everywhere, but in places with high rainfall, erodible soils, we're losing much more soil than we're actually forming. And that is an impact on our natural resources and the goods and services that we get from soils. And again, we've tried to look at sort of future climate change scenarios. You know, we hear that extreme weather events, high intensity, long duration, frequent rainfall is likely to increase erosion rates. And we've predicted what it might look like in 2050. And this map shows the amount of soil loss associated with erosion rates in the future. And you can see in some places then these losses exceed the current depth of soil that we've got from our national soil inventory, and that is of great concern in places. Okay, so that's doom and gloom. Sorry about that. That's all very miserable about sort of the problem of soil erosion, but let's be a little bit more positive and constructive, and this is where I'll lead on to Rob and Lynda's presentation. Well, what can we do about it? It's all very well saying how bad the situation is. What can we do about it? And I think, therefore, it helps to look at the factors affecting soil erosion and then understand how we might control them. Now, in erosion by water, obviously the rainfall is very important, and in wind erosion, the wind is very important. And frankly, there's not much that we can do about that, as I say, at the local farm field level. But if you then look at the other factors that influence erosion, things like soil properties, things like organic matter content, the bulk density, the microbiological activity, other things like slope length and slope steepness, things like land cover, land use, and land management. All of those factors that are highly correlated with erosion, that relate to erosion, can be manipulated by us as farmers and growers and land managers. We could put in buffer strips, for example, as you can see on the right-hand side. We could grow a cover crop over winter to protect the soils from erosion, from rainfall and from wind. You know, we could replace where hedgerows have been taken out, where we've got very long slopes. What about putting in a grass buffer strip just to break up that slope length and reduce the energy of any flow that might cause erosion? And then there's things like crop rotations. Again, I've mentioned field structures that Lynda's going to be talking about, and so on. So I'm going to end now on this slide, which demonstrates a point that there are lots of soil erosion control measures out there. We kind of know what those erosion control measures are. And if you look at the fact sheets and the papers and the books and so on, there's quite a shopping list of erosion control measures out there. The problem is we don't have much evidence of how effective they are, and that's really, really important. What we do know is there's quite a variability, as you can see from this graph. These are these different erosion mitigation measures. And, you know, encouragingly, they all improve erosion control. You can see from the mean value, then we're getting quite effective erosion control. But what is concerning is the range of effectiveness for some measures. And that's really because their effectiveness will be depending on the site. It will depend on the location, the soil type, the slope, the land use, and so on and so forth. And so what our research is trying to do is to understand why these mitigation measures work in some places, but not in others. And we hope that that is then going to inform and give guidance to farmers and growers as to what is the best practice for their given set of conditions. So I think with that, that's my last slide. I think I haven't overrun as I usually do. I'm a dreadful timekeeper, so I think hopefully that's I've used my time, and hopefully that's been useful and will give a sort of insight to what Rob and Lynda will be talking about next. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That's good. We are in good time. We don't have any questions at the moment for you. That's
fine.
We've got,
I can take the rest of the afternoon off.
but questions may come. We'll have a panel sessions. Like I said, please do keep the questions, type the questions in as they go. Just personally, Jane, I was just wondering, if you're a farmer and a grower, and maybe you've not really worried about erosion before because the slope is fine. You think you've got enough organic, this sort of whatever soil organic matter content, and you put in all these other things. But then you have like an extreme event, like we had high winds this year, and we had floods for the last in the last few years. Is there a way, just as yourself, something you could do straight away to see how much? Is there a way to quantify what you're losing so that because I think personally, I would think and I my granddad, obviously different circumstances, but we were on a farm. Is there a way that farmers and growers could just go in and assess what's come out so that it's on their mind? I lost so much soil last year. Is there a way to quantify the amount of soil loss per unit squares on a piece of land that could that people could really use just to assess how you're doing, really, as to take stock?
Yeah, absolutely, Grace. I mean, I think, ideally it would be something like setting up erosion plots so that we could monitor the amount of runoff and soil that was lost, throughout the year. But I appreciate that takes up land. That means you have to sacrifice some land. It is quite an expensive mission to actually set up those erosion plots, but that would be the best way to actually quantify the amount of soil loss. With water erosion, it's easier because we could place those erosion plots on a slope and see how much runoff and soil loss comes from that area. Wind erosion is more difficult to actually collect the soil that is lost, but it is possible. And we had many years ago, we had a system up at the Arthur Rickwood experimental station near Chatteris, where we were actually measuring and monitoring wind erosion in the field. And we were looking at in-field measures such as planted barley strips and inserted straw strips, as well as the traditional shelter belts that we use to try and control erosion. I think, and I think what you've said is very true, that from year to year, the weather is so variable. And this is what makes it very difficult to get the signal from the noise of all of that environmental variability. It's a wet year, it's a dry year, it's a windy year, it's not a windy year. So again, these need to be long-term experiments so that we can actually pick up that signal. And I appreciate that many people on the call haven't got long-term. They want to have a solution and an answer to these issues much more quickly than that. And I think that would lend itself to maybe going down a modelling route. And there are some fairly rough and ready, simple erosion models where we can actually predict how much soil loss is occurring. If we know things like, so for erosion by water, if we know the rainfall, if we know the soil, we know the slope length and slope steepness, we know the land cover, land use and the land management that's being used, we can get a rough and ready estimate of how much soil loss is taking place. And frankly, even if that number is a relative number, we can compare from one year to the next, for one crop versus the next. And I think I showed a slide there of some of the erosion modelling that we've done. What would be the difference if I had a rotation that had a cover crop, for example, versus if I had the same rotation, exactly the same rotation, but without the cover crop? What impact does that have on my erosion rates over the whole course of that rotation? And that's the sort of thing that we can predict using these models. And needless to say, obviously, if you can extensify the rotation, if you can put some grass layers in there, grass is associated with a very low erosion rate, and that might compensate for maybe high erosion risk crops. There is an argument there that within the rotation as a whole, as long as I've got some erosion control crops at some point, I might be able to grow the more commercially viable crops that may have a higher risk of erosion. Now, I've got to be careful what I'm saying there, because it sounds a little bit irresponsible to say that's absolutely fine, grow a crop that is, really bad for erosion, but then offset it with another year where you've got low erosion rates. But I think what's more important there is that the grass is going to build up organic matter. It's going to have a nice root structure, which hopefully will make your soils less susceptible to erosion when you have those more erosive crops in the rotation.
Yes, Jane, actually, since I spoke, you've had 5 questions come in. So we'll kind of do 2 of them now, and the rest can be answered in a panel, because we're kind of losing time. Yeah. What are your views on tillage? It seems we have become obsessed with tilling the ground for lots of food production.
Yes, and so I think tillage, and again in my slides, you know, tillage, reduced tillage, minimum tillage, zero tillage, whatever you want to call it. I think reducing the intensity of tillage has got a big role to play for all sorts of reasons, not only erosion control, but also, you know, decarbonising agriculture is very trendy at the moment. And also, I'm thinking about the costs of cultivations and tillage. Can we get away with fewer cultivations, fewer tillage, less intensity, less fuel use? That's going to disturb the soil less, which is obviously going to be beneficial as far as erosion control is concerned. But having said that, I appreciate there are growers out there that need to get a fine seed bed. They need to have that fine till so they get that good seed soil contact at establishment. So me going around saying, oh no, it's got to be all direct drill and so on is really not helpful, because that's not producing the conditions that are going to help crop establishment. And the other thing I would say is that reduced tillage isn't suitable necessarily for all soil types. I know it works extremely well on light soils, but certainly the heavy, wet, cold clay soils, it's very, very difficult to use some of those minimum tillage techniques to actually try and drill into a crop residue from the previous harvest, or indeed a cover crop. There are challenges, and that's why I think a one-size-fits-all is not appropriate here, and I am concerned about some of the ELMS proposals, that we've got to have appreciation that one size does not fit all. We've got to reflect regional, local differences as to why these erosion control measures will work or maybe not. And I think that last slide, which showed the variability of performance of things like reduced tillage, demonstrates that beautifully. We've got to understand why these practices work in some places but not in others, and that, knowing that, helps us advise and work with farmers to say, I really wouldn't try cover crops here, or you really should try a grass buffer strip there, or whatever. I think that's what we're trying to do to get that evidence base.
All right, Jane, I think we're going to have to move on now. We've got other questions there, and we'll try and answer them later.
Happy to do so. Yeah, no problem.
But if we are not able to answer all questions, keep them coming. We'll still post them to our speakers post the webinar, and we'll collect the answers and make that available on the website. So just moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Rob Simmons. Rob is a reader in sustainable soil management at Cranfield. He's an applied soil scientist with over 25 years experience of sustainable soil management, founded on a robust understanding of the associated processes. Rob has an extensive research portfolio and has been principal investigator or collaborated on BBSRC, NERC, Innovate UK, Environment Agency, RAP, and AHDB funded projects. And his portfolio of work has focused on mitigating diffuse pollution through applied soil conservation options such as the grassed waterway designs, optimizing whole farm big data use, controlling splash detachment and structural sealing through polymer-based solutions. So Rob, over to you.
Yep, sorry, I'm here now. I was just I was busy listening about myself. Too beginning to go actually to be here. Yes, thank you very much for allowing me to have the time to talk to you today. Thanks very much for Grace and AHDB for organising this. Just following on from Jane's presentation, so I'll be talking more about practical solutions, how to manage some of these soil erosion issues that we have. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at tramline and wheeling management case studies. One series of research that we've done in potatoes, looking at tramline and wheeling management in potatoes, and then the next case study will be for asparagus. But I think the asparagus work and the potato work has applications for other row crops in the UK as well. So if we just have a look at some definitions, just tramlines are narrow, convex, unvegetated strips, tend to run up and down the steepest slope in the field. Effectively, they're belt markers for spray operations, and they represent about 5% of an arable field. They tend to be heavily compacted with significantly reduced infiltration, and they promote runoff generation and soil loss. And they also convey runoff from the inter-tramline areas and soil from the inter-tramline areas, and they're concentrated flow paths for runoff and erosion. So some work that was done by Martin Silgram et al. The references at the bottom there. They found that between just over 5 and 15% of winter rainfall was lost via runoff from tramlines, as well as the associated nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment and pesticide losses. So if we look at wheelings, wheelings are effectively potatoes and other high value horticultural crops, carrots, baby leaf, for example, onions, typically cultivated on raised beds, require multiple tillage or trafficking operations. And again, those inter-bed wheelings are often highly compacted with very low infiltration rates and very high runoff and erosion risk. But the difference here is that often these wheelings, or the interbed wheelings, interbed rows, provide a solid platform for harvesting operations. So I've had conversations with carrot growers before saying, you know, you really ought to be doing something about your wheelings because you're going to get lots of runoff and erosion. And they just shake their head at me and say, but then how am I going to harvest my crop? So it's really important to understand how some of these mitigation options will or won't work in different contexts. So often the wheelings are also there to shed excess runoff. So in the context of asparagus production, to shed excess runoff to prevent disease, for example. So why are tramline managed? Why is it important? So I have a short video here just to show an example of an excessive high rainfall event on some salad fields, baby leaf salad, and you can see quite clearly that as well as water being shed from the beds, you can see how those wheelings and the compacted wheelings are just holding that water and transporting that water from the field. And you can see that there's a high turbidity in that runoff, and effectively you're losing that water from the field. So this is green water that is lost. Okay, so if you want to get your crop water, your groundwater recharge and your soil moisture recharge for your crop, you're losing that in these situations. And the majority of this water is running directly from those compacted wheelings. But again, those wheelings are important in terms of trafficking and later harvesting those fields. So you have a difficult situation here where you need to have access, yet the access is causing you to lose water and soil. So I need to go back up, sorry. So the other example here is not so extreme. So this is just an irrigation event on some baby leaf. And you can see again that these tram lines are conveying that irrigation to a very high irrigation event. It's coming off those beds into the wheelings and you're losing that. So it's wasted water effectively. And under extreme cases here on the right hand side, you can see how compacted wheelings can lead to very significant soil loss and gullying. This is a potato field in Herefordshire. We did some work with Sainsbury's, Greenvale funded project along with NIAB Cuff. NIAB were looking at different destoning depths and web sizes to look at efficiency and trying to improve efficiency of tillage operations in potatoes. We were looking at the effect that that would have on runoff. So we did some simple experiments and just applying rainfall to different scenarios. We were finding that between 16 and 30% of runoff of rainfall that was applied was being lost as runoff. So this has major implications. So you might want to tweak your irrigation systems, but if you're losing between 16 and 30% of that through runoff because of the compacted wheelings, water is shed from the beds into the wheelings and lost from the field, It's quite significant. And this is particularly important for control of coal and scab, where your water management is really important for those 3 to 6 weeks post-tuber initiation. So what are the options that we have to try to mitigate soil loss? Gosh, I'm not doing this very well. Okay, so we have looked at several studies. So we had, under the same project, MSc funded projects, looking at the wheel track roller developed by Charles Craik, who was a potato farmer from Yorkshire. And this has 2 leading tines and a rotary wheel behind here that creates a convex shape on the soil surface, which sheds water into the side of the wheelings. The tide ridger creates these small, or the damodiker as it's also called, creates these small reservoirs on the field within the wheelings. And then the bioengineering wonder wheel, which has a similar mechanism or operation as the wheel track roller, with leading tines creating slits either side of the wheeling and this convex shape which has shed water into the wheelings. There's also other work that's been done previously. So the work of Martin Silgram, looking at duck's foot tine to loosen the wheeling, and also the Simba rotary harrow, all effectively trying to loosen the compacted wheeling and allow water to infiltrate. So we have done some studies and we did some research, 2 sites. One was near Ipswich on a sandy loamy sand soil, looking at a salad variety. And we looked at the wheel track roller, which is in yellow here, and the controlling wheeling, which is effectively doing nothing. And on this particular site, with these rainfall events that we had a reduction in runoff volume through the use of the wheel track roller of between 33 to 66%, depending on the rainfall event. We also looked at soil loss, and soil loss was again reduced between 34 and 55% for specific rainfall events. And you can see here, going back to what Jane was saying about protecting the soil surface, improving the canopy cover, etc. As the potato crop develops and as the canopy cover develops, actually your risk of soil loss and erosion reduces, because your crop is absorbing a lot of that rainfall and utilizing that rainfall and absorbing the kinetic energy of that rainfall. We also looked at the wheel track roller in Herefordshire on a silty loam soil, and in this context here we were getting between 73 and 87% reduction in runoff volumes. So it's a significant saving in water that is actually going to your crop. And in terms of soil loss, we were getting almost 100% reduction in soil loss. And again, as the canopy cover develops, then we have significant reductions in soil loss as well as runoff. We have a second project where we're looking at, this was a spot farm event hosted by Elvden Farms, where we were looking at the wheel track roller and some other the same methods that we were showing you just earlier. But just want to focus here on the wonder wheel, because we had the wonder wheel specifically on a trafficked and compared that to a untreated trafficked wheeling, and we had almost a 90% reduction in runoff volume from the wonder wheel trafficked wheeling. And again, from a soil loss point of view, we had over 80% soil loss reduction from the use of the wonder wheel. So this can be applied, and I've seen this, I've showed in the slides. You can go to the video which shows you how this is operating in the field. And actually you can see from the form here that it is very effective at shedding water to the edge of the wheeling where you have the soil that's been loosened. That water can then go by capillary rise up into the bed and be utilized by the crop. Also want to talk now about some of the work that we've done for mitigating wheeling management in asparagus. Now, obviously in asparagus, we can't use some of the same techniques that we'd want to use in potato production systems. So we've compared conventional practice, which is effectively re-ridging on an annual basis with significant number of passes. The asparagus is harvested, hand harvested, between late May to the end of June, April to June. So you have a lot of foot traffic, in all weathers, and you have a number of vehicle passes as well. So we had the conventional practice and shallow soil disturbance. So that's with a winged tine to a depth of 25 centimeters. So loosening that compacted wheeling on an annual basis, compared to a ridged and non-ridged crop. So the straw mulch, which has shallow soil disturbance, the compost, which has shallow soil disturbance as well, the zero tillage option, so that's effectively ridged for life with no other treatment applied, and companion cropping with the companion crops seeded in August, and that's either mustard or cereal rye. And what we've done is we've looked at the penetrative resistance. So we use a penetrometer to look at the penetrative resistance down the profile in the center of the wheeling. And in 2018 was the first year that we applied the shallow soil disturbance. And you can see here that wherever we have shallow soil disturbance, we have a shift, significant reduction in penetrative resistance to the depth of that disturbance. So all the mulch treatments here have a shallow soil disturbance, and also the bare soil, shallow soil disturbance, non-ridged and ridged treatments. So the consequence of this is that we have a significant reduction in a significant improvement in infiltration. So for any treatment here that's highlighted in green in this table has a significant improved infiltration rate as compared to the conventional practice. So where you've got shallow soil disturbance, as we would expect, because we've mechanically enhanced the soil and broken up that compacted soil, we get improved infiltration. What's interesting here, in 2019, we weren't able to apply the shallow soil disturbance. So we don't see this significant reduction in penetrative resistance to 20-25 centimeters depth. However, the PAS 100 treatments still had a legacy improvement in infiltration rate as compared to the conventional practice. Now in 2020, we were able, in 2020, we were able to apply the shallow soil disturbance again. And again, you see this marked improvement in penetrative resistance. So we're alleviating compaction in that wheeling to the operating depth of the winged tine. But what is interesting, and that's both in the bare soil as well as the mulch treatments. And here we've had the mulches applied, the PAS 100 compost and the straw for 3 consecutive years. Okay, and what we're actually seeing here in terms of penetrative resistance, we see that the non-ridged PAS 100 treatment, the compost treatment, and the straw mulch non-ridged treatment also have a significant reduction in penetrative resistance to depth. So this is your conventional practice. That's the penetrative resistance profile here of the conventional practice. And actually, we have a significant reduction. So we believe that that's because that organic matter has been, although it's applied to the soil surface, when you're subsoiling, you're incorporating that into the soil, and then the microbiology is drawing that down into the profile. So we are getting significant improvements. What's also interesting is that the companion crops, either the mustard or the rye, in none of the years have had a marked improvement in alleviating compaction in that wheeling. And that might be due to the duration of the companion cropping growth, or which is, so they're broadcasts in August and they're effectively sprayed off in March prior to the bed forming, if that needs to be done, depending on the treatment. So there may not be enough time. They are shaded by the canopy of the asparagus, so they may not be developing as they normally would in an open field. But we see no improvement in penetrative resistance or soil structure as associated with the companion crops. However, the mulch treatments, as I've said here, are highly effective at improving, in combination with the shallow soil disturbance, reduced compaction. And the consequence of this in 2020 is that we had extraordinary infiltration rates into the bare soil, shallow soil disturbance treatments, and also the PAS 100 and the straw mulch treatments as compared to conventional practice. So they are very effective combination of the mulch and the subsoiling at alleviating compaction in the wheelings. So what does this actually mean? So we did some, these are penetrative resistance heat maps. So this is the crown zero line here, and this is the center of the wheeling. So in 2016, pre the ridging that was undertaken in 2017, you can see the penetrative resistance within the profile. You can see how the ridging operations and the tillage associated with ridging has reduced the penetrative resistance around the crown, which is what you want, and within the bed. But you have a little bit of increased compaction within the wheeling here due to the trafficking of the ridging operations. Now, if we move on to 2020 and conventional practice, you can see that there's a highly significant increase in compaction in the wheeling and all the way to depth. So you've got a legacy here of multiple trafficking operations, both for the tillage, for the bed forming, and for the harvesting operations. So how does that compare to some of the other best management treatments? So zero tillage here, where we haven't done any re-ridging, you can see that this has remained loose. So the asparagus roots are actually exploring into this loose area of soil here, but we still get some compaction in the wheeling due to the foot trafficking. If we look at the non-ridging operation with PAS 100 compost, which is associated with subsoiling as well, you can see how that compaction is alleviated in the wheeling, but you also have some a little bit elevated compaction here as compared to the 2017, but significantly less than the compaction associated with conventional practice. And the real win here is the application of the straw mulch and non-ridging. So we have a significant reduction in compaction in the wheeling to depth through the combination of straw mulch application and shallow soil disturbance. And also you've got no increase, we've actually got a significant decrease in compaction as compared to the conventional practice. And the interesting thing as well is we have no significant impact on yield. So there is no yield loss associated with the straw mulch and shallow soil disturbance as compared to conventional practice or zero tillage. And in fact, we get an increased 20% uplift in asparagus yield associated with the use of PAS 100 compost in the 2018 and 2020 years. So some take-home messages. So runoff and erosion control can be effectively achieved through the timely application of tramline and wheeling disruption technologies, be that in potato production systems, asparagus or other row crops. However, we have to make sure that it fits in with the agronomy as well. It has to be the right technique so that the agronomy isn't compromised. This mitigation of compaction in the wheelings can have a positive impact on water use efficiency and also on off-site water quality. And what we're seeing certainly for the asparagus work is that the combination of mulch application and shallow soil disturbance can alleviate deep-seated compaction and increase infiltration in these high-value horticultural crops. So just as a summary table here, so combining the work that Cranfield's done, either through the master's thesis work of Marion Duquette, but also looking back at the work that Martin Silgram did and his team did, you can see that the tide ridger on loamy sand soils was effective between 67 and 90, almost 90% effective at reducing runoff. In potatoes, the duckfoot tine and the wheel track roller actually has been used in a number of studies and is relatively consistent in terms of its efficacy. And the Wonder Wheel, which is a new technology which is being increasingly adopted. So the take-home message is, yes, you can manage this through appropriate technologies. So thank you very much for listening. And thank you very much to all the sponsors that funded this work, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Rob. Brilliant. We've got a question for you and a lot more for Jane and yourself as well. I can see you can answer these because they flooded in after we've gone on. Here for you, did you find an improvement in soil biology where the companion crops were planted? So was there an improvement in soil biology as well?
Right, so not under the companion crops actually, but we have seen a marked improvement in the macrofauna, so earthworms and other macrofauna associated with the mulch treatments, particularly the straw. I think the challenge we have with the companion crops in the asparagus is that the time that they're established, and we have always had trouble establishing them. And some years we've had to re-establish. So there are open field asparagus all around us where the companion crop establishes perfectly. It just doesn't establish on the trial plot, and we still haven't come to terms with that. But we did take some soil samples this year, and we're looking at the PLFA. So we're looking at the microbiology to see if there is a difference between the conventional, the zero tillage, and the companion cropping and the mulch application treatment. So we should have those results available through Lucy Moscova's PhD, and they will be in the end of project report for the asparagus work. So the FV450A final report, we'll have those results there.
Okay, and another one here. I recently attended Dr. John Boardman's speech on connectivity hosted by BSSS. He mentioned the use of straw fences as a method of holding and filtering sediment-laden water. My question is whether you know of any successful trials involving the tillage incorporation of straw previously used in this manner to reintroduce displaced soils.
Okay, I'm not sure about that technology. Going back to something that Jane said earlier, that prevention is better than cure. So it is obviously these straw mulches are a plaster effectively. So you're trying to stop that soil leaving the field, but you haven't stopped the erosion taking place. This is something that Jane and I will debate often as to what is the right thing to do. But the right thing to do is to try to stop the soil erosion in the first place. I haven't come across anything, but I'm very impressed. Joe Nizlamonsky has some published work as well in Katina, one of our old PhD students who looked at the effectiveness of the shallow soil disturbance and mulch to reduce erosion, and she was and runoff volume, and she was getting up to 90% reduction in soil loss. So that's in wheelings and that's in concentrated flow areas, but I haven't come across that yet, but I can see how it would be effective. But it's better to stop that soil being detached and transported, because all you're doing is putting a sticky plaster on the field effectively.
Do you have anything to add, Jane, or is that?
No, I saw John Boardman's presentation as well, and certainly I think he's got a very valid point. It is about connectivity, but I totally agree with Rob that it is about control on site. And if you're starting to look at, if you're looking at sediment control measures, that's too late.
Yeah,
okay, in terms of that, there's a difference between erosion control measures and sediment control measures, and I'm very keen that we don't look at sediment control. We should look further up the landscape as to where the source of that erosion is occurring. And again, I'm just repeating what Rob said: prevention is better than cure. But yeah, I did see John Boardman, and I think it was relevant that models don't build in, or some models don't build in that connectivity, which is very important.
Yeah. So
thank you both.
Lynda will talk about connectivity a little bit in her presentation. Sorry, Lynda.
Okay.
But it is really important that we recognise the fact that if you've got to the point where you're trying to prevent that, if you're at the point of sediment control, then you've lost the soil, you've lost the nutrients, you've got a pesticide off-site, pesticide water quality issue, and you've also lost that water. Which is important in terms of the, getting that soil moisture
upstream erosion in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both. Now we're moving on to Lynda. We've got enough time. We should be done by 15:30. Lynda is a research fellow in soil science at Cranfield. Her current research interests include causes, consequences, and remediation of soil compaction, soil erosion and its mitigation, sustainable soil management, the use of polyacrylamide to prevent soil capping and soil splash. And again, Lynda has worked on a range of projects funded by DEFRA, the Energy Institute, Environment Agency, AHDB. So over to you, Lynda.
Okay, thank you. Can you just confirm you can see my screen? It has come up.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Good. It's always an unknown. So thank you. And yes, following on from what Rob and Jane have said, I'm just going to talk about one of the other tools in our toolbox. And we do have a toolbox to apply different things to different locations. So basically what we're talking about here today is a landscape capable of supporting what we want to do on that land. And we have ways of classifying it. So we have the land use capability, which is a system or a way of arranging different kinds of land according to its capacity to support a long-term use of it sustainably, so without erosion, after we've taken into account the physical limitations of that land. And those physical limitations will include the soil depth, the soil texture, the permeability, its erosion status, and the slope gradient. Now, when we look at those physical limitations, soil depth is, apart from eroding and reducing soil depth, is difficult to generate new soil. It occurs so slowly that we always consider soil to be a non-renewable resource. Soil texture is also a property of soil that is very difficult to change. I know some people do attempt to change soil texture, but in reality, over large volumes, soil texture is best left as is. But we do have capacity to do something about permeability and erosion status. And indeed, what Rob has just covered has shown how we can modify the permeability of the landscape to improve it, to increase infiltration capacity, and how we can apply mulches or cover crops to that land as well to also reduce the erosion status. The other thing we do have some control over is slope gradient. More specifically, I guess it's better to talk in terms of the topography of the landscape, because it's not just a simple slope, it's quite a complex slope that we might be dealing with. So we know when we get land capability wrong, we begin to see features such as obvious flow paths across the landscape. We might see scars within the landscape as well. And the other features we might see is a depositional area where the sediment has finally ended up and come to rest. Now, all these examples are extreme, where in reality, across the majority of the farmland, what we see is very subtle signs of this erosion process. We might see rills, or it might simply be we often see runoff that is muddy in colour and we know is carrying sediment off the land. At this small scale, we might not consider the erosion to be any significance, and it might be that individual case or individual field itself is not providing a significant amount of sediment in its own right. But when we look across a landscape and across a catchment area, if small amounts of erosion are occurring from a number or multiple sites, this diffuse pollution adds up and becomes a catchment-wide problem. So even when we're considering small-scale erosion, we might want to factor in some of these methods that we've been talking about today. So when it comes to our choice of lands and landscape, and particularly if we're thinking about choosing based on the gradient of slope, we might not think a field like this would necessarily be appropriate to growing any crops. However, it depends on the context. So this image here was actually taken on Jersey. For most of the year, this field area is actually permanently covered with grass. But for a short duration of time, this becomes one of Jersey's prime producing parcels of land for the Jersey raw potato. And during that short season, it's at high risk of potential erosion. So what really drives us, I guess, to make the choices of using such land or any land choice at all? Our biggest driver is the value of the crop compared to the potential risk of growing that crop. So the crop will have a physical value. The higher the value of that crop, for example, asparagus is a high grossing crop, whereas carrots would be less so. We might be prepared to take slightly higher risks, i.e. we assume we won't get a major erosion event, but we know there's a high likelihood that we might. And we've got to weigh that against what the potential cost of that erosion risk occurring would be. So those costs can include not only the loss of potential volume of crop, but it may also be a risk of economic risk due to fines through loss of sediment onto roads and into watercourses as well. Another main driver of our choice of land and that drives us onto marginal land is how available land is. And this will again depend on the crop types that we're trying to grow. So if we use the example of carrots, carrots are grown predominantly on sandy soils. They're sometimes grown on peat, but nowadays in the UK we tend to just find carrots being grown on sandy soils. The actual land bank of sandy soils is quite small. And on top of this, we have fluctuating demands for the crop. So if demand is high and land is small, then that will force us onto marginal land. The other consideration is with a small land bank that we work often with rotations. Now the rotation might just be because of the demands of other crops that we need to supply, but part of that rotation is actually to do with disease control. So disease control might limit us from using that same parcel of land for that same crop for a significant number of years, so between 5 or 8 years potentially, before we can go back into the same sandy soil with a carrot crop. And that puts pressure on land and makes our choices slightly less rational. And then the other thing that drives us to making a choice is tradition. So going back to the example of our Jersey Royal potato, well, that's a traditional crop. It's a major economic provider for the islands. So it's historically been grown there. So the argument may therefore be, why should we change? We've always done it. We've always run this risk. But the issue here then is how is climate and climate change then affecting the risk of erosion occurring at those times when that land is most vulnerable. Oops. This is where your computer slows down. So how can we overcome topography? Well, at the extreme cases, we might think of terracing. Now, usually only relevant to smaller islands where the demand for food and being able to grow your own crops is very much restricted because of the limited land available. Certainly, if we're talking about highly productive, intensive farming, then terraces are not one of the options that we would consider to use, because we can't access that land with sufficiently large vehicles to get the productivity that we demand for the food quantities that the market is requiring. So there are other options. We can potentially introduce check dams, and this comes back to the question that Jane and Rob were answering. We can introduce other features such as filter socks and silt fences. So features such as this, ideally located at distances down a slope before rainwater has become erosive. So again, we need to understand the length of the slope, the steepness of the slope, and the texture of the soil to be able to put features such as this in to be effective. What we don't want, as Jane and Rob have already said, is for erosion to occur. So we're looking for features that can stop the accumulation of overland flow, prevent it becoming erosive, and allow it to infiltrate. So we prevent the overall generation of erosion coming from that land. Features such as filter socks and even silt fences and the like can be used as a final resource to stop a sediment going out of a field and onto the road. But again, just to repeat what Jane and Rob have said, ideally we're looking to prevent that erosion in the first place, and these types of features should only be used as a final resource as a sediment trap from that system. So the other option we have, and the one we're going to focus on today, is potentially looking at how we can modify not necessarily the slope gradient or the steepness, but a feature that we can use within that landscape that will help spill the energy that shape of slope will generate. So today we're going to focus on grass waterways, although there are other options around. So what do we know about erosion and then introducing grass waterways? So this is some work carried out by one of Jane and Rob's PhD students, and she was investigating the efficiency of grass at preventing erosion in a grass waterway. So she's using our flume here to investigate what the erosion rate of that soil is. Oh yes, I can find the video. When we put a flow of water across, we can see the clean water coming in here from the right hand side. As the water travels across, we can see it not only picking up and transporting it within the water, but we can also see slightly larger particles being bounced along the soil surface as well, so beginning to move the soil. And we can see that that's being carried in the water and out of the system for a considerable amount of time. So we can see where we have bare soil, particularly where it's been disturbed through ploughing, that the likelihood of that eroding once we have concentrated flow is high. So same flume experiment, but this time on the same soil type, a crop of grass has been grown to simulate our grass waterway. So now we can see that as the water enters, again, it's nice and clear. The actual feature itself does make the water begin to rise up. So we've got quite a deep transport of water going across here. So quite an erosive force across the land. But I think you can still make out at the far end here, the water remains almost as clear as it's come in at the top end. So yes, we know that grass is a reasonable crop for spilling the energy, the erosive energy of any flow of water, enabling the water to pass through, but not pick up sediment as it goes. So why does that become important within the landscape? Well, this comes back to that question of connectivity. Perhaps these are our field areas here. Within our field areas, we might be able to identify several micro channels along which water under certain rainfall intensities will begin to flow, and the direction it will begin to flow in. Even between these fields, we can see that the water will move across and potentially accumulate at this point here. And we know that will generate a particular amount of runoff leaving the farmland that we own here. Now this piece of land is set in a wider landscape. So potentially these fields above that may not be belong to the same farmer at all can also be generating runoff. Runoff is allowed to move between fields. There's no law that says you can't, you have to prevent runoff occurring. What the law does state is that if you change your land use and it makes the runoff worse and that causes an issue further downstream, then that can make you liable to prosecution. So here, if we have this excess water coming onto the land, that can lead to excess water coming through and over the land, which results in a much bigger runoff potential from the fields. So this may prohibit the use of this land for that particular land use that we've chosen it for. So the only way we'll be able to do what we want with this land is if we can actually manage this water in some way so that we can prevent this larger volume of water running off of it. So one of the options, and as I say, the one we'll focus on here today, is grass waterways. It's not a new option. This sort of idea, the concept, has been used widely for graded channel terraces, farm ponds, spillways, and dam spillways and the like. So it's a tried and tested method, but we're applying it in a slightly different way. The main features of a grass waterway, that it follows the natural depression where the water naturally converges. So we're not modifying where the water course is going. In fact, you're not technically allowed to modify the direction of runoff. So it identifies where that main runoff will occur, and then the grass waterway mimics that pathway across the landscape. It follows that natural course of the runoff. So we're not modifying it in any way. Compared to other options such as terracing, there's very little earthworks that have to be undertaken to construct these. In the main, you're following the natural curve of the bottom of the gully anyhow. But typically it is engineered slightly to give you a slight parabolic shape that forms the channel, basically a channel bed. It's designed to accommodate gentle but not sharp bends. So if we have one watercourse coming in this direction and another watercourse coming in that direction, then the design would have to accommodate that with multiple grass waterways connecting into each other. It's designed to deal with discontinuous flow, and that's predominantly because it's a vegetated cover, and if it's continuously saturated, that would damage the vegetation, probably ultimately killing it and removing the protected zone or properties of that grass, so making it inefficient. So as with its other applications, it's only really designed to cope with the runoff from particularly major storms. It can be lined with a variety of things. The one we're focusing on today is obviously grass, so vegetated linings, but they can be also just simply lined with stone or a simple geotextile. And as we'll see in the case study that I'm going to present just in a moment, you can combine vegetation and geotextiles quite effectively to improve the overall design of the feature. So as I say, the first step is identifying where the location of the grass waterway will be. That's usually quite an easy feature to identify, either standing in the field when it's raining and seeing literally where the water runs off, or where a rill or gully is beginning to develop from that particular land use. Don't have to use geotextiles, but the advantage of using a geotextile is it provides an almost instantaneous solution to the problem. It increases the roughness of that surface, it provides protection, it allows infiltration and reduces erosivity, therefore reducing the amount of sediment that's being moved across it. But for a long-term solution, then this geotextile can be seeded, and indeed by using a geotextile, you're preventing the seeds being washed off before they can actually effectively germinate and establish. So that's another advantage of using the geotextile base. But in the long term, especially if you use a natural geotextile, the geotextile will eventually degrade, and the grass itself will take over and be the long-term protective element within the design. And this is a design, so actually the size and the width and the depth do depend on what element of risk, again, we're prepared to take. So most of the designs we do, we tend to opt for a 1 in 10 year storm event. Now, arguably, with the changes in climate that we're seeing, this may still mean that we do have certain years that we may still be at risk of erosion leaving this land, even if we have this feature on. So that might be a consideration in the future of the overall design. Do we have to increase the design capacity to account for this? So we have our landscape, and within that landscape, somehow we have to decide, perhaps the features aren't necessarily obvious, but from the shape, we need to design our grass waterways where they best fit within the landscape. And the case study I'm going to take you through here is basically one that Colbury Farms asked us to instigate for them. So this was the field in question. The particular farmer wanted to put this into asparagus, and there was some resistance for that because of the risk of historic risk that there had been in that field of loss of sediment from this land, particularly at this top right corner here. So our priorities are to find a way of minimizing the slope length whilst maintaining its practicality for the farmer. So there's an optimal design, which would be the scientifically optimal. This won't allow erosion to occur. But as Rob said, sometimes that's not necessarily the most appropriate design, because it may not be practical for farmers to utilize. In this particular example, there was also a requirement to minimize slope steepness, as well as, it was a need to minimize slope steepness, but they wanted to avoid ponding occurring because the particular crop was not tolerant to its roots being sat wet. So while again the optimal design might have gone to a much shallower slope, that would have retained more water on the land, which would have had a detrimental effect on the overall quality of and quantity probably of the crop itself. So again, a practical factor that had to be considered. And ultimately, there's a balance between minimizing the loss of productive land over establishing the actual suggested changes. So the size and the extent of the grass waterways, and also balanced up against the cost of that. So simple grass waterways themselves would take up more land. So advantage of using grass and geotextiles is that it does reduce the area of land that will be taken. But a disadvantage could be the offset of the cost of that versus the profit from the overall land. So again, it will very much come down to what crops are being grown and what value those crops incur. To be able to identify where we're taking these within the landscape, we can simply use digital elevation models or simple contour maps to identify the main directions of flow. From here we can see these are high points in red coming down to low points in blue. And as I said, the issues they were having was runoff coming from this top right hand corner. So here we can see that the runoff will be coming predominantly in this direction and flowing indeed towards that top right hand corner. By using the digital elevation model, we can describe the landscape in a range of we can define the direction of the rows that we might want to take to optimize that slope length. But again, that has to be done in collaboration with the farmer, because obviously too short a length row becomes impractical to maneuver farm machinery. So again, there's a consideration of row orientation, not just for reducing the erosivity of the flow, but also to make it practical to use vehicles within it. So at the end of the day, taking into account the change in topography and other elements, the design of this field could be divided into a number of catchments. So a catchment here is defined by this type of area and this type of area. And from these catchment areas, we can define the amount of water that might be arriving down to the point where we know it's beginning to accumulate and flow. So here in this image here, we can begin to see the design of the grass waterway. At the top where we have less water running in, and we're assuming nothing is coming from other fields in this example, then we have quite a narrow grass waterway. As we progress down towards the bottom of the slope, then the width of that grass waterway increases as it has to accommodate more and more water. The other features within this, obviously, the grass waterway itself can't be driven over. So we have to introduce other features to make the land accessible. So some land is removed because of trackways around it. Certainly the volume of water, because to accommodate the requirements of the farming, couldn't be infiltrated just simply with the grass waterway. So a overflow bund and retention pond was also incorporated to deal with the excess runoff.
Hi, Lynda. Just wanted to let you know that it's 3:30 actually at the moment, and I thought that was a natural break point, but we will probably start losing people as we go. So I'll let you finish your slides. But for those who are listening, remember that we'll have the recording on the website. If you need to go, you can go. If you want to hang on, that's still fine. We've got some questions. We'll answer them, and we'll probably overrun by 10 or so minutes. So Lynda, don't speed up too much, but you know,
there's only a couple more slides, so I think.
Thank you.
Okay. So we've got our overall design. So what has that enabled us to do? Well, we've gone from a parcel of land that originally looked like this, that had an erosion issue that meant that there was concerns about a change in land use. That parcel of land has been modified, has been engineered to accommodate runoff from a parcel of land that now has a proportion of that land that can be put under production, but we have lost a certain proportion of it to other features. So our grass waterway here and the road system around it, as well as other spill aprons that couldn't be accommodated in the direction of flow just because of the topography. So to deal with any erosion coming off of here, we've had to accommodate that with additional protection measures. Oops, come on. Interesting. Ah, that's good. Okay, so the advantages. Well, yes, it reduces the off-site impact of runoff with the potential of reducing the risk of fines. In this case, it meant that the actual suggested land use change could actually go ahead. So arguably it has enhanced the land capability. It's gone from a parcel of land that wouldn't have been capable of supporting that particular land use choice to a parcel of land that is now capable of supporting that long-term choice. Disadvantages? Well, yes, there is land take. So there is a consideration of how much land is lost to production over the ability to use this parcel of land. So without this strategy being implemented, this parcel of land wouldn't have been allowed to go ahead in the production that it has now been put to. So there is an amount of weighing up between is sufficient parcel of land left to make it viable as a productive parcel of land for agriculture. It doesn't prevent soil detachment, and particularly where we have to accommodate the direction of the vehicles. Obviously, we still have potential issues of erosion coming down the tramways, but we have those other tools that Rob has talked about that can also be implemented within this system to prevent that erosion occurring. One of the advantages that some farmers find is that it seems quite convenient to use the grass waterway as a trackway, but that, because it introduces compaction, would reduce its efficiency. So it does mean that we do have to take out that little bit extra proportion of land because of that. So to conclude, grass waterways provide an effective means of managing runoff and erosion, but they do not prevent the runoff and erosion, but manage it within the field. So we're maintaining the sediment within the field. We might not absolutely prevent erosion occurring, but the erosion doesn't leave the field. We might have runoff, but that runoff is clear, and again that can be managed by designing in a retention pond. We can use it in combination with other erosion control features, and it's the combination that makes this for a particularly effective feature. While it may limit the proportion of the field that can be productive, like I say, it may be the difference between being able to farm that land or not. So again, as land resources become more and more of an issue, our desire to go over to this kind of engineered landscape may change. So thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now or later.
All right, thank you very much, Lynda. We've got 2 questions for you, which we'll take, and then if there's any time, we'll bring Rob and Jane back in to answer some of the questions that are still here. What percentage field was lost to the grass waterway in your case study?
I think approximately about 15 to 20%, probably 15.
That seems quite a lot, isn't it?
Sorry, can I just interject a little bit? It depends on the size of the field. I think it's typically about 5 or 6%. Okay, that's actually taken up by the grass waterway itself. And the dimensions of the grass waterway can be reduced by, I'm not sure if so the dimensions of the grass waterway can be reduced if you manage the runoff on field. So if you can improve the infiltration within the compacted inter-row wheelings, then you don't have as much runoff to have to deal with, so your grass waterway can be reduced in size. So the grass waterway is very much depend on the topography of particular peak runoff.
Yeah, so it does also depend on the topography of the land.
Sorry.
It does also
if you reduce
depend
the
on
volume
the
of runoff, then you can reduce the dimensions of the grass waterway.
It does also depend on the topography of the land. So in this example, it was more complex. So there was additional features that took some of the productive land out.
Okay, so obviously it's case by case, depending on specific scenario. We've just got a comment here from Michelle Fountain. There was a NIAB EMR. Could grass waterways incorporate plants that are beneficial to pest, natural enemies, and pollinators? We are looking at these to manage runoff from polytunnel crops. Seems like there's an opportunity to do both here. And she's gone on to say it would be good for you to contact her and collaborate on the work.
Okay, no, that's good to hear. Yes, the slight proviso here. So you're looking for a cover crop that doesn't have isn't tussocky in nature. So you want something that provides an even coverage, isn't tussocky, because that will divert flow and concentrate it into microflow channels, which could potentially then erode. But I'm sure within that limitation that there will be a range of crops that could potentially be considered. The other slight proviso is again considering how if you need to manage that land cover, i.e. this grass waterway, it's sort of short growing grass, so you actually only have to go on and cut it once a year. So it depends on access, but again, there's ways around that as well.
All right, thank you. Yes, Rob.
Sorry, can I just add? So the grass waterway designs are also related to the grass sward and the Manning's N associated with that grass sward. So if I've had discussions about this in the past about having pollinator species and other plants incorporated in the grass waterways, but we would have to probably look very carefully at how that affects the Manning's N. And also there's a management implication in terms of the herbicides that are used on the main crop. But if this is a polytunnel situation, then I don't think you have to worry about that, because you don't want to spray off your grass waterway. But we'd have to look at the Manning's N, and we'd have to look at how that's going to be managed as well.
Okay. Maybe one for Jane here, I'm not sure, but do you feel that soil drainage should be subsidized in the new UK government agricultural regime? Removing excess water should leave space for the next heavy rain event? So do you feel that soil drainage work should be subsidized in the new UK government agricultural regime?
Yeah.
Obviously, some of your work impacts on
Yeah.
legislation, presumably.
Well, yes. I mean, if the ELM scheme is delivering what it's meant to be delivering, it's meant to be public payment, public money for public goods. And something like drainage, you could argue that well-drained land is then less susceptible to flooding and generating runoff that may cause some of these flooding events that we see that obviously have an impact on society, and therefore it is a public good to control flood risk and to regulate water. So there is a logic there that says, yes, that is a public good by managing our soils better, including draining them, such that we don't get these off-site impacts such as flooding. And I think related to that, not only related to that, but is also, you know, this net zero carbon and what agriculture can do to contribute to that. And again, it's very important. Drainage is an important part of that as well. But certainly, yes, I think for flood control, water storage, then I think drainage is a very important part of that.
Yes, can I agree with that?
Whether or not ELMS will actually cover that, I don't know. I don't know if anybody on the call is from DEFRA that would be able to answer whether ELMS would cover that in the payment for public goods.
Yeah, certainly to emphasise the importance of drainage. We don't. For a long time, we've underestimated the value of drainage in managing flood defences. So people often see drainage as a contributor to downstream flooding, but actually we can use drainage very effectively to minimise the risk of downstream flooding if we design it correctly.
All right, I think we're going to have to end there. We've 10 minutes overrun. We've still got a number of questions, some of them linked to drainage, which you probably can answer later on. We can put this on our website. I'm just going to put my last slide on there just to end this webinar. So thank you to Jane, to Rob, and to Lynda, and to you for being here. We've lost some of our crowd, but that's okay. They were there for most of the time. For bases and roster, if you need those, please contact Maya Kotecha. There's an email address. If you've got any further questions that you think are important for your own specific scenario, please send it to me and I can send it on to the speakers. But again, the recording will be made available on the AHDB Horticulture Events Archive page, and you'll see other relevant soils things that we've run there, as well as on other AHDB sector-specific archive pages. Like I said, our website is a work in progress, but you should be able to find a lot of things if you go on Google and you put the words that's, you know, the keyword and AHDB. So this really, we've come to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us and have a good evening. Goodbye.